Koto. Welcome to Aotearoa Circle's webinar on nature-related disclosures. Just wait a bit as people continue to file in. We've got about 217 registered for today's webinar, so expecting a good turnout and excited to talk to everyone about the journey that various businesses have been on in the nature-related space. So, kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Aotearoa Circle webinar on nature-related disclosures. We're looking forward to sharing the next hour with you and discussing our growing reliance on our natural capital and nature's economic importance for business and our economy. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, Director of Implementation at the Aotearoa Circle, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. We've ensured your mic is on mute, your cameras are off, and that way we can maximise the time we have with everyone's attention. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge our guardians and rangatahi advisory panel, some of whom are here today, as well as all our partners who are attending this webinar today. Thank you all for your continued support. For those of you who are not familiar with the Aotearoa Circle, a warm welcome. We're a public-private partnership, a collaboration between businesses and government agencies with a shared vision of enabling the restoration of our natural capital for the enduring prosperity of New Zealand. Our natural capital, resources from air and water to soil and land, are the engine room of our country and our economy. Unfortunately, they're being eroded as degradation of nature continues due to climate change, invasive species, and a suite of other human-induced impacts. We know that everyone across the globe is heavily dependent on nature, but economically, few countries are as dependent on natural resources for their well-being and their economy than New Zealand. Our exporters are dependent on nature for being largely primary sector, and within our borders, we know that natural capital supports our tourism sector, as well as a large portion of our food system, which relies on New Zealand produce. In summary, our success as a country hinges to a large degree on a healthy, sustainable environment. So it follows, if we want a thriving economy, we need to grow our natural capital, not just conserve it. Unfortunately, in the thick of the dual crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, we're facing environmental disruption at a level greater than we've ever experienced in modern history. This is evidenced by severe storm events such as Cyclone Gabriel in 2023. Gabriel was the costliest tropical cyclone on record at the time in the Southern Hemisphere, costing us over $14 billion. That's the average annual income for 104,000 homes in New Zealand. And worse still, the storm took 11 lives. Many don't realise there are 1,600 homes still uninhabitable to this day as a result of Gabriel. Aside from storm events, entire communities are now having to be redesigned and relocated. South Dunedin is looking at a fight versus flight scenario, with early estimates indicating $2 to $7 billion spend to address the impacts experienced by the 5,000 properties located there. Auckland Council has proposed to move the entirety of Kumeu town centre due to flood risk, and just this week, Buller councillors are deciding on whether to relocate Westport. Why is this happening? Climate change is unfolding. Yes, we know this, and we talk about it a lot. We act on climate-related risks and invest in climate-related mitigation. However, the other side of the same coin is that nature is not present as it was and as it should be to buffer us from these impacts. Gabriel brought about 185 mil of rain in one 24-hour period in Gisborne. That caused severe permanent damage to the region as millions of cubic metres of soil disappeared into the ocean. In Fiordland, 250 mil of rain a day is expected each year. The difference? The existence and richness of nature. Nature can handle a lot of disturbance and in fact thrive on it if it's healthy. But the truth is New Zealand lacks natural resilience because in places we lack nature. And this compromises our economic resilience, putting our prosperity as a nation at risk. So what does this mean for business? What risks do you face and what nature dependencies do you have? A good first step for businesses to understand their own natural risk exposure is through a nature-related assessment. The Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, provides a framework to do exactly this. The TNFD process guides businesses through a process to understand their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So our agenda today features 4 great speakers with the opportunity for questions of our panelists. If you do have questions, please drop them into the Q&A function. We'll try and feed as many to our panelists as possible. First, a bit of scene setting. It's been nearly 2 years since the publication of the TNFD recommendations after the framework was tested by businesses and financial institutions across the globe. The resulting recommendations and guidance are intended to encourage and enable businesses and financial institutions to assess, report, and act on their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. The intent is by doing so, entities are better able to understand their respective risk exposure and integrate nature into their strategic decision-making. A dual intent of the task force is to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes toward nature positive outcomes, aligning with the global biodiversity framework. To support this journey, the Circle ran 2 TNFD boot camps in 2023 and 2024 with PwC. Circle partners learned more about the framework to help understand where and how nature-related financial disclosures can help future-proof their business. We also ran a governing natural capital course with Deloitte to help inform directors of our leading partners on business dependencies on nature and governance. Fast forward to 2025. Over 500 companies globally have committed to voluntary disclosures across a broad cross-section of industries, and one early adopter is Littleton Port Company. Last year, the port released the first published nature-related disclosures report in New Zealand. The report, which I encourage you to read if you've not already, demonstrates a way to describe the impacts or dependencies a business has on its local ecosystems and the risks and opportunities that arise from these. But the person who knows this best is Crystal Lenke from the Littleton Port Company. Crystal joined LPC in 2018, heads up environment and sustainability team, but also held multiple roles since joining, including RMA planning. The port was just starting to set its sustainability strategy when she joined, and she's been heavily involved in progressing it along with her colleagues since that time. Crystal, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Aotearoa Circle for inviting us here today to talk to you about our journey with the TNFD. So I'm just going to quickly share some slides. Hopefully everybody can see those. So first of all, I do apologize if you were expecting to hear from Phil DeJoux. Phil was wanting to be here today, but unfortunately today is also our board and ELT strategy planning days. So he asked me to fill in last minute. Now, 12 minutes isn't a lot of time, I guess, to talk about our entire journey. So I thought I would touch on a few key points, really highlighting how and why we started, some of our challenges, and what are our next steps. Because even though, as Mark said, we have disclosed our first report, we're still very much on this journey. So I thought I would also focus more on our impacts and opportunities rather than our dependencies, as this is where the majority of our work has been focused, particularly within Whakaropo, Littleton Harbour. But hopefully most of you who are on here today have had a chance to read our disclosure report. And it does give a good overview of how we have used the framework. And hopefully it does inspire some of you if you're thinking about disclosing in the near future. And so I would say that please do feel free to reach out to us if you want to get into more detail than what we go into today. So I thought I would start out by addressing a few of the key questions that we often get asked. And the first one is, why have we actually chosen to disclose our impacts and dependencies on nature when it isn't mandatory? And the second is, how did we actually get the business and management to buy in? I guess in terms of why we disclosed, the simple answer is we wanted to. We had been working, our journey had started long before TNFD, and we had been waiting for a way to articulate our own biodiversity positive goal, which is to undertake our activities in a way in which positive actions for nature outweigh our negative impacts. And the TNFD framework gave us this opportunity to do so. And the way that we looked at the TNFD is that it was putting nature into business speak. There we go. So as I said, our journey with TNFD began well before the development of the framework. Now, following the 2010 and 2011 Canterbury earthquakes, the port's infrastructure suffered extensive damage. And it was during this time, around 2015, that we developed the Littleton Port Recovery Plan. And it was developed to guide the rebuild of the port, but it also planned for the port expansion over the next 30 years. It also committed LPC to a collaborative catchment management approach to a healthy harbor, working alongside Manawanawa and our local authorities and community. Ngāti Wheki, who are our local Runanga, they urged us to shift from taking from the environment to contributing to a net gain in Mahinga Kai for the harbor. And this really marked the start of our biodiversity commitment. So we've been working on this for the last 10 years. Part of that work was also the development of the Whakaora Healthy Harbor Partnership and the Whakaora Catchment Management Plan. And this really emerged as a vision to restore the ecological and cultural health of the harbor. Over that time, we also progressed internally, developing our own sustainability strategy that contained a net biodiversity positive goal. So when we put a paper up to our board in 2023, we basically said, hey, we're going to be an early adopter of TNFD. And there was just acceptance of this at the time, basically right from the start, because they could see that we had the capabilities in-house, and we were also undertaking restoration activities, but have also been doing all this work within the harbor. And the TNFD was really just a way then to bring it out to the forefront and bring it out to the business, and also put us, out in that business world. So we were a little bit surprised when no other businesses, had signed up, because we knew that there was a lot of great work that was being undertaken by others around New Zealand. And I guess for us also, there was a lot of trust in our team from the business. We had the support of Phil, who is our chief officer, the wider executive team, and also our CEO to just get on, with the work. And I think their trust really reinforces the importance of the nature disclosures, that it's seen as a priority for LPC, and it does align with our strategic business goals. So, as you can see from that timeline, this has been a 10-year journey for us. And when we first started working under the TNFD, that started in 2022, to signing up as an early adopter in 2023, to disclosing in 2024. There were a number of challenges during that time. And I think, as everybody is probably aware, it's not easy. There's a lot of guidance out there, but actually disseminating it down and working through it, it takes a long time. But one of the key challenges for us is actually determining how much of an impact our activities actually had on nature, and from what point in time we needed to assess the impacts from. How far back in time did we need to go? Now, as I'm sure you're aware, the Global Biodiversity Framework suggests a baseline of 2020, but as a port, if we were to use a 2020 baseline, on paper, we'd already look like we would be contributing positively to nature. The 2020 baseline doesn't actually account for the initial loss of nature as the port's developed. It doesn't account for our biggest impacts. And we really felt that this could be perceived as greenwashing. So we did assess a number of baseline dates, and we mapped port development activities over this time. there was extensive port development and loss of habitat between 1875 and 1900, but also again from the 1950s, and then more recently from 2011 and 2020 with the recent port expansion. So there was a lot of debate and discussion within the business, but we did determine that 1875 would be the most credible and robust baseline date for us to use. It was also the year before the Harbor Board was established in 1876. So part of the discussion with the business was, even though we've chosen this 1875 baseline, it doesn't mean we want to go back to what the harbor was in 1875. Because if we look at paintings and photos from this time, we know that the terrestrial habitats in 1875 were actually in poor condition from land clearance, and that while the marine habitat was not pristine due to this land clearing, they were in good condition. But what this actually means for LPC is that we want to account for the changes in the state of habitats from 1875 to where they're likely to be in 2050. So this led to where we were, I guess, now today, and what you can see in our disclosure report. So from this assessment, and I won't go into the details because that is all outlined in our TNFD report, but from here we can understand the activities that have the biggest impacts on nature, and also how they impact nature. So for LPC, land use and marine use change, pollution, and invasive species. These are the key drivers to nature loss, but these are also our opportunities to achieve a net positive impact. Now we know that overall, we have, from this assessment, a net negative impact on nature overall, and that the biggest impact for us is actually in the marine environment. So I guess I would say to companies is that, getting to this point was a big milestone for LPC. And maybe it's, like I said, it's, it took a long time for us to get here, but I think this was the easy part. Now we actually need to get, into the doing. We need to take this information and turn it from negative into positive. We need to shift that dial so that we are sitting, above the no net loss line. So for us, this is really important because this assessment provides a reference for us to inform discussions, but also to develop targets. And this leads us to where we are today. Probably one of the most surprising things that I have seen come out from our TNFD report, and this does align somewhat with dependencies as well, is the amount of discussion that it has, I guess, generated within the business. And actually now we have management saying to us, how do we actually accelerate some of this work? So we've been tasked with developing a biodiversity roadmap. And this is very much based on the outputs of our TNFD report, but also taking into account the action framework that is recommended by the Science Based Targets Network. And now we have drafted 9 targets consisting of 17 actions that we think that we can implement over the next 5 years. So between FY25 and FY30, under the avoid, reduce, and restore categories. They're going to help us get from the negative and start into that positive space. So this has been really exciting, for us. We do have, and I'm actually presenting on this in just this afternoon to our board. So hopefully all of the actions and targets will get signed off. But I think also going through this process and what companies will hopefully understand it or find out through their own work is that, like LPC, there already is a number of projects that contribute to restore and regenerate, reduce and avoid through your OPEX and CapEx planning. And these are the three areas that we're focusing on as LPC. If we want to actually make large-scale ecosystem change, this is where we're going to need to work with our partnerships throughout the harbor, through the Whakaora Healthy Harbor program, and really move into this transformation space. And again, we have really great buy-in and support from management to really accelerate that transformational piece as well. So yeah, that's it for me. Because I know I only had 12 minutes, and you've got a lot to talk about today. But that's really just a high-level overview of our journey. It has taken us, 10 years, and we did disclose our first report. We will be disclosing again in FY25. We will be adding our two other sites, Midland and City Depot, and building on some of the metrics and targets that we disclosed as well in the original report. So yeah, look out for that in around November 2025. So thank you.
Crystal, thank you so much. Really fantastic insight into the journey you guys have been on. An impressive journey at that. Know you have to head off, so thank you very much for joining us, and all the best with your strategy session this evening. So look, now it gives me pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Annabelle Chartres, Partner, Sustainability, Climate and Nature Leader at PwC New Zealand. PwC is a valued partner of the Circle. We work together on several work streams, as well as our TNFD bootcamps, or including our TNFD bootcamps. Annabelle, over to you to share more on the TNFD from both a global and domestic perspective.
Thanks, Mark. Hopefully everybody can see my screen.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see such a great turnout and interest in nature. As Mark said, I will spend the next 10 minutes or so giving a really quick run around global trends in terms of how nature is developing there, very quick. And then I'll dive into, I suppose, what we'll call the lessons learned from the boot camps we ran with the Circle over the last couple of years to help organizations who are starting out on this journey, to give them some insights into what they could do first and what they should consider. So here we go. Nothing's moving. Why? There we go. Okay. So starting off, at a really macro global level. Every year, the World Economic Forum releases its annual Global Risks Perception Survey, which is essentially their survey of global businesses, and it captures sentiment on what is keeping global business leaders awake at night. And in each of the past 5 reports, so last 5 years, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse has ranked in the top 5 most severe risks that will affect the world over the next 10 years. The surveys also highlighted that biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse is likely to worsen almost all other identified risks. So, for example, water and other resource scarcity can worsen the impact of, say, involuntary migration or social cohesion. Similarly, and Mark has covered this off quite extensively already, nature loss is inextricably linked and tied to climate change. And so it's really, really important that we never lose sight of that connection and decouple our focus on them. At the same time, there's a huge amount of talk about nature-based solutions to climate change. Climate change is identified as one of the key drivers of nature loss. And as natural habitats are destroyed, there will be even greater rates of climate impact as well. At the same time, nature holds so many solutions for us all in terms of helping us to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees. So it's really vital that when we think about climate and our actions there, that we do it with a lens on protecting nature as well. In terms of the global development and the landscape for nature, there's a lot of talk about it emerging. What I wanted to touch on very quickly is the rate at which it is emerging as a topic that everybody needs to be thinking about and acting on, particularly businesses. And nature has developed similar infrastructure for global alignment as climate, particularly around target setting and disclosure. Similarly, these frameworks and the targets and guidance that has been developed have been designed to align with all that's going on in the climate space as well. What's really interesting about this slide and the trajectory of development is that climate, if you look back to the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in 1988, it's then taken 27 years to get to the starting blocks of 2015 with the TCFD. Similar trajectory for nature has taken just 11 years. So we built muscle around climate, kicking and screaming. It's coming together for nature much faster and much quicker. As Mark has talked about, we ran a couple of boot camps over the last couple of years for the Aotearoa Circle, and about 20 New Zealand organisations participated in these sessions, which were really intense programs to upskill companies and individuals around the task force on nature-related disclosures. This is a voluntary guidance framework, so no one is mandating it anywhere in the world. And it's really important framework, even if it is imperfect, to help organisations understand nature-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. Regardless of whether you intend to make nature-related disclosures public and do what Littleton Ports has done, the LEAP process that's embedded in the foundational element of the TNFD framework is a really, really critical internal process for helping to understand nature in your business. For those of you not familiar with it, it has 4 elements that you can see on the screen. Locate, which is how you understand how you interface with nature, how your business shows up in nature. Evaluate, which allows you to prioritize your impacts and dependencies. The assess phase, which allows you to identify your material risks and opportunities. And finally, prepare, which takes all of those previous steps and helps you consider how you might respond, and if you choose to, report. So over the course of the boot camps, we gathered lots of insights from participants about the journey of learning, but also how they were going to proceed in learning more about their engagement, interface, and reliance on nature. And there were 6 key learnings that we gathered from this process. The first and most obvious is that you just need to get started, and you shouldn't be too scared about this. Yes, it is incredibly complex and complicated, but organisations who clearly defined their scope at the outset felt less overwhelmed by the scale of the process they were embarking on. It's really helpful to generate a working hypothesis at the outset and really think about what's likely to be material for your business in terms of processes and activities that have an impact on nature, depend on nature. What are the risks and opportunities that those processes and activities might generate? It's also incredibly helpful at the outset to align across the organisation on the goals and resourcing of this exercise. What are the financial, human, and data considerations and time allocations you need to do this assessment? It's not straightforward. It's not going to happen overnight. And so considering that at the outset and getting buy-in and engagement to start on this journey is really, really important. As many of you on this call may be climate-related entities, one hugely important lesson is to learn as much as possible, leverage, steal, borrow from your climate journey. Participants who have already educated built awareness, brought issues to their board's attention and their executives' attention around climate, and have built a strong business case around climate. Use those learnings to develop your nature business case. Of course, if that didn't go so well first time around, this is probably a good opportunity to try a different angle. But that's a really, really important starting point, because if you don't have buy-in from the top, it's very, very difficult to embark on something as complex and complicated as this is. Lots of participants talked about how they leveraged their work from the climate-related disclosures, particularly as it applied to risk management practices and processes. So how you integrated climate risk into your enterprise risk management framework, how you did that assessment in the first place, can absolutely be adopted and evolved for nature. Similarly, if you've been working on climate, you probably already have more nature-related skills and data than you think. So consider some of these things. Firstly, the data and analysis you undertook around suppliers for your Scope 3 footprinting will be really, really helpful. I've talked about your risk management processes, absolutely vital to consider how they can then be extended for nature. What sort of geospatial skills or tools did you use? What were the data analytical skills and tools that you adapted or adopted or learned for climate? They can easily be then used for nature as well. Anyone who's undertaken climate scenario analysis or developed scenarios, whether as part of their climate-related disclosures work or separately, really, really useful to see how they can be evolved to more broadly think about the impact on nature. And similarly with the climate risk quantification process that some of you will be embarking on, this can be extended to nature as well. The LEAP process is not a linear one, and it's intentionally structured within the framework to allow an iterative approach. So remember that, because despite the fact that the metrics and targets piece comes in the final prepare stage, some participants found it really, really useful to review those really early in the process to give you an idea of the type of nature indicators you need to consider, particularly for your sector. The other thing to highlight is that the TNFD have a hugely useful resource in their website, particularly the sector guidance materials that they have. And if your sector is covered by the materials they've developed, really, really useful to access those early on to bring some further awareness and comfort around what you might be doing and where you should be looking across your business as it interfaces with nature. The data piece is something that comes up a lot, and concern around whether there's too much or too little data was an ongoing debate in the workshops that we held. One thing to remember is that you don't need to start from scratch with collecting that data. And a lot of the nature-related data that you can perhaps rely on, at least in the early days of beginning an assessment, can be collected from the operational data you already have. So things like water consumption or value chain information. A good starting point is, of course, to look at the data you're already collecting for disclosures you're already doing. And only after you've assessed all of that and considered it against your needs, then you can start going out further to understand where additional data might be required. With accessing the right data, it really shouldn't be a barrier to progressing. And you need to think about other ways you can get around some of the more tricky aspects of the data question. Certainly thinking about starting with a qualitative assessment is quite useful, and also what publicly available data you might be able to access at the outset helps, and who you could collaborate with to access that data. The other really important aspect that will come up early on is deciding on the granularity of the data that you're accessing and need to use, and how that makes a really material difference to how you can assess your risks. It's important also to consider the trade-offs between using global data sets versus local ones. The global data sets are much more readily available, and they're really helpful in that they're internationally comparable. So depending on who's using your information, being able to compare against a competitor or a similar business in another market could be quite useful. The problem is, particularly in a New Zealand context, is they often lack the resolution that really allows you to get very specific around what you're looking at. And that's where the local, more granular data sets come into play. They can provide much more decision-useful information, the trade-off being it's often a bit more difficult or more work to access those in some instances. And they don't always assess nature consistently, so that comparability question comes into play. Nature is hyper-location specific. Businesses, as we all know, are interconnected, and no business is an island. And we are all dependent on the same natural capital and ecosystem services. And similarly, we have cumulative impacts on the same ecosystems. So you could be doing everything right in the actions you're taking with respect to nature and the natural assets you rely on, and there could be upstream or downstream activities by others that could completely neutralize or worse, degrade nature irrespective. So collaboration with partners, stakeholders, competitors even, is key. And making sure that you translate what you're doing to the various audiences you need to engage with is really, really important. Engaging with stakeholders throughout the process goes without saying. It's not something you can just do at the end once you've finished your assessment. And it's particularly important to bring together a pretty varied bunch of stakeholders for discussion on this. So, of course, you're going to have your sustainability teams involved and community, but don't forget your risk functions and your finance functions and any cultural or advisory partners that you need to have as part of this process. And then finally, it goes without saying that you should really aim for progress over perfection. The TNFD estimates that it takes probably 5 years for an organisation to build up to a full value chain assessment. So the expectation is you can't go to zero to maturity overnight with looking at nature and understanding its impact and your impact from a business perspective. At the same time, nature can't wait, and your customers, the regulators, others, stakeholders are very quickly moving to asking questions about nature and bringing more scrutiny to considerations of the business impact on nature. And so the sooner you can start understanding and building confidence in your nature journey and your nature story and actions, the better off you're going to be. In terms of ending on some action that all businesses can take to get started now, and what we see as no regrets actions, there's probably 3 areas you consider. And I've sort of covered those in the points I've raised in the last few minutes. The first is that education piece. It's really, really important that your board and executive are up to speed on what nature means for your business and are bought into the actions or the journey that you need to take as an organisation. The assess piece is vital. You have to understand your interface with nature, and that's where the LEAP assessment comes into play. The sooner you can start understanding what that's going to entail, bringing together the resources you require to do it, and getting started on that process, the better it's going to be for you as an organisation. And then finally, we think it's pretty important to get ready for disclosures and regulation. It's a fairly fluid and volatile and uncertain landscape, both in New Zealand, but also internationally around broader sustainability reporting at the moment. At the same time, I don't think there's any waste in identifying your data needs and gaps, understanding what you might need to do, and getting to grips with something like the LEAP assessment process early, so that you're in a position to start thinking about nature and integrating it into your broader strategic decision making and risk assessments. Thank you.
Annabelle, thank you so much. Your insights are always valued. Something that really resonated with me was that the latter point that you made there. don't let perfection get in the way of progress. And earlier on, you spoke about not being intimidated. Taking a step through that early scoping stage in and of itself can be really helpful. So great insights. Thank you. Look, everyone, now joining Annabelle for our panel discussion on taking the leap towards the nature-related financial disclosures are Tina Frew, Head of Sustainability from Meridian Energy, Annalise Davies, Senior Manager Sustainability at Fonterra. A warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us today for the panel. And Tina, I'd like to start with you. We understand that Meridian is considering its approach to TNFD. Obviously, we're part of the boot camp. Last year, I think it was, that you're part of that. And you're also active with your nature biodiversity work. Have you determined the best path for your business as yet, or are you still going through other considerations on your journey?
Yeah, kia ora koutou everyone. I guess a lot of our experiences are not dissimilar to maybe what Annabelle and Crystal have already shared, but yes, we've got a roadmap in place, which I guess you would call our path to kind of advance our nature work this decade. At its core, I guess the focus of that is around determining like the additional choices we might make to help sort of flora and fauna, and it does include piloting TNFD. So more recently, this has sort of had a practical focus on developing, I guess, a consolidated map of our connection points to nature, which Annabelle and Crystal have already sort of touched on. It's borrowed from the LEAP process and other pieces, and we've certainly used like quite a range of information from what we already have ourselves through our own work, but also sort of other publicly available information. Lots of lessons so far. I don't think we're short of info, so that's probably a big one as well. It's about trying to consolidate that down into a decision useful format, which I think the LEAP process is helping with. I guess the other thing I'd say is alongside, piloting some of these emerging practices, probably like many on the call, like there is actually a bunch of good work already being done. And so, we've continued with focus on delivering what we said we would around our Forever Forest program or work with kakapo support and things like that. So doing what we said we would, definitely piloting these emerging pieces. Just a couple of other considerations, I guess, thinking about our company strategy and sector context is, I guess, the sector's growing at pace to, I guess, help New Zealand decarbonise fast. And so action on climate is, I guess, a central focus of what we're getting after. And a part of that does include building a lot of new generation assets around the country. And I know that this work really reinforces the focus we have on how we do that matters a lot. So I think for us it's important that we still have that focus, but we know, as has already been said, that climate and nature are very interconnected. So we see that work as having a benefit for nature as well at a high level. Another consideration I think I'd raise, a last one that Annabelle already touched on, is we're learning a lot from our climate journey. So we are, I guess, an entity that's connected under the New Zealand climate standards, and our experience is that is bringing a very high level of, I guess, rigour to the substantiation of our work and how we communicate that. And it does take time. Doing that. So I guess when we think about applying this to, I guess, an expanded nature scope, I guess one of the big things we found is like taking people on the journey so you can genuinely embed this into your core business practices at a pace that people can understand and meaningfully apply is really important. So all those things Annabelle mentioned, like working with your risk teams and all of those other pieces to solve that together is really important. And yeah, I think stepping back is just making sure we maintain an adoption choice piece that has us always asking, like, are we benefiting nature from this? And don't get too caught up in biasing too much time on reporting, but it is a part of it in the end. But yeah, that's where we're at the moment, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. Broad considerations that transcend across various boundaries within your business, and that's understandable. And Annabelle, lifting that up to a governance perspective, what else is needed to get directors aware of what this means and what it can help strengthen strategy around?
think the key thing is that many directors feel as if it's yet another thing on the agenda, and there's that feeling of being overwhelmed by another consideration that's jostling for attention amongst many other priorities. That doesn't diminish the fact that organisations still need to look at and understand their nature-related risks. But the counterfactual to that is that there could be opportunities as well. The important thing, and Tina touched on this, is that it's not just about getting a report out the door. If that keeps you honest, sure. But what's more important is going through the process internally and understanding whether this is a material business risk that needs to be embedded and ingrained and operationalized and mitigated in some way. And so boards need to view it through that lens, I think, and understanding how they might be impacted in the future. And again, whether the enduring business model of the organization that they are governing is at risk because of its reliance or dependency on nature. And it's that broader context of the fact that, that 70% of New Zealand's economy or exports rely on nature, that the enormous numbers that are being thrown around globally. As humans, we all get these raw inputs from the planet that we're on. And so when you go back to how your organization generates the revenue it does from nature, and look at it as a business issue rather than a reporting or a compliance obligation, I think that resonates a lot more with boards, because to be having to sign off on yet another report just to justify sentiment in the market is probably not as useful.
Yeah, no, absolutely understand. Annalise, coming to you. Annabelle spoke about data. Anyone who's worked with Fonterra knows that data is not something that you're short of. There's a wealth of farmer data that you have access to. How do we measure nature with consistency, though, in a robust, secure, accessible manner to help businesses better understand environmental impacts?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Kia ora, everyone. I think we're all aware that data and measurement and metrics, and I'll touch on it, is one of the most challenging parts of understanding our impacts and dependencies on nature, and especially the development of those targets. So while Fonterra has a substantial amount of data from our farms, we also need the data from our catchments, because I think it was touched on that a lot of those outcomes-based metrics are from our catchments rather than the practice-based metrics that we can get from something like our farms. And to do this, we need a standardized kind of suite of metrics and indicators that will enable that consistency and comparability in measurement. And that needs to be relevant in a New Zealand setting and with the right information down to a catchment level. And we need to make sure we have the right metrics for each catchment for that location-specific data. And by standardizing those metrics, which could be informed by things like TNFD and SBT in a New Zealand context, we can get that consistency needed and also focus action on what matters most for nature. And the other side of that is that the data needs to be up to date. There is so much data available from government agencies, but it's often 5+ years out of date. And I think you can absolutely use that for that initial impact assessment. It is amazing. It is there. Use it. There is so much data available. But when we get to the next stage of, so what are we going to do about those impacts? And to get to that target setting, we need to have that continual access to data. So how can we use technology such as remote sensing to access data in that more consistent basis? And to do that, we need collaboration across government, mana whenua, landowners and business.
Yeah, brilliant. And fantastic that you mentioned mana whenua. Circling back to you, Tina, how important do you believe it is to incorporate other views into company TNFD journeys, such as communities iwi or others? And do you have a view, does Meridian have a view of bringing in mana whenua perspectives into the LEAP process rather than sort of separate stakeholder engagement?
So I think I share a lot of sentiments that Annalise just shared, but I do think it is really important. I mean, I guess the TNFD frame, I think it was kind of an investor-focused kind of audience in mind, like it uses those kind of language and concepts. They're quite specific, but they're also very broad, and that it's intended to be sort of a globally applicable sort of framework. So yeah, during the workshop series that yourselves led was really valuable, and I highly supported the notion of what does a New Zealand sort of take on TNFD look like, because I think there's some really valuable sort of knowledge sets and other perspectives out there. I think one thing that was useful for me when we were navigating all of those discussions is that I think at the end of the day, most people have a shared interest in reversing nature loss. And so I think when we're thinking about how might you go about unpacking your choices or making decisions, I think keeping focused on that common goal was useful. If I kind of go back to that mapping exercise I was sort of referring to as an example, which is, again, trying to bring together all of that information into a decision useful format. Like, I know now that our first cut will not be perfect. We've talked about progress over perfection, and we'll have to improve the quality of that over time, just like we did with, greenhouse gas emissions over 20 years. So, I fully expect that, the knowledge that comes from, communities, mana whenua, iwi, will help add to the quality of that. Definitely, I think in particular, as well as getting the quality view, is when you start making decisions about where to from here, I think doing that in collaboration to draw on that knowledge is really important. Like some examples now, I think about the simple thing like our eel trap and transfer program, and working with the local rūnanga to figure out like how do we go about doing something like that in a really practical way. Like I'm sure that building on those experiences that I know lots of people on the call will already been doing when it comes to decision making for different will be sort of vital. So yeah, we're in the early stages of practicing some of these emerging pieces, but I think there's a lot to be gained from it, not just around decision making quality, but also that communication piece. Like when I was thinking about how do you genuinely embed it, I think it could be easy to only speak to a certain group of people if you purely use that TNFD frame. So
yeah. Annalise, coming back to you, look, stakeholder expectations are changing. And Fonterra is acutely aware of this. Customer expectations are changing. Do you believe there is or will be a commercial necessity, perhaps driven by international drivers, to disclose on nature in the future? And if so, how far away? I know it's a little bit of a tough question, but how far away do you think that could be?
Yeah, I think, we're all quite aware of the geopolitical landscape in which we find ourselves at the moment. And if you'd asked me this question a few weeks ago, I probably would have had a little bit of a different answer. We know that governments globally are not necessarily pulling back on their sustainability agenda, but there's definitely a slowing down. And one of those key changes we've seen is the release of that EU omnibus in the last few weeks, where previously thousands of businesses globally would have had to disclose on nature starting next year. Those proposed changes reduce the number of businesses captured under those regs and also delays the implementation. But fundamentally, it still stands that there will be a requirement to disclose on nature in some way, shape or form. So we will see businesses starting to disclose by the end of the decade under regs. There's also a bit of a gap being left in sustainability leadership internationally. So I'm fascinated on a personal level to see if we'll see other markets kind of step into that role, particularly with the imminent release of China's 5-year plan. But fundamentally, to Fonterra, government isn't that key driver of action, and meeting our customer expectations is how we are able to return the most value to our farmers, which is what we are here to do. And the conversations to date has primarily been focused on climate. We came out with a low carbon product with customers just last month, but we are starting to see that shift into nature, and particularly those connections being drawn around that climate nature nexus, and that the only way we are going to be able to achieve our climate targets is through nature, whether that's from a mitigation or an adaptation perspective. And so that we think that these disclosures will only become more important to our customers in probably the very near future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Annalise. Look, a final wrap-up question, and I'll throw it to you first, Annabelle. In the past, when we've implemented environmental responses, there's been unintended consequences. One solution can create a new set of problems or a new problem that we then need to tackle. Do we face that risk now as we enter into the world of nature? And how do we step into the world of nature in a way that avoids a repeat of the same mistakes while creating a nature positive economy. So a tough one, but I'll start with you, Annabelle.
I think absolutely there's that danger, because as I sort of said at the end of my presentation, no business is an island, and the ability to do right, but then someone else that has impacts that are negative on another business community catchment are absolutely there. So communication, engagement is absolutely key. In the past, the boundaries that organizations have built around themselves have been quite massive, and this ability to operate, or this belief that you can operate in a siloed state, is probably being challenged by our need to respond to nature and climate, because we have to work together. So I suppose my parting point is that collaborate, and communicate are going to be the really key elements of how we face down doing good and then having that good undone and being worse off than we are.
Yeah, thanks, Annabelle. Very insightful. Tina, your thoughts?
Actually very similar to Annabelle. So yeah, like, I mean, there's unintended consequence risk with everything in life. So, and we didn't even speak about this before, but my key message was the same as yours, like progress over perfection. I think if we focus on not starting or perfect, we're going to be too late overall for sure. I think just having the awareness to stop and ask the question and have a discussion on unintended consequences is a good simple thing, and genuinely kind of try to unpack like what's a real risk behind the underlying concern. And like has already been shared, I think kind of being open to learning and more permission to accept that we're not going to get things perfect the first time, but like sharing experiences, having your roadmap, working through it, and just I think being cautious about a healthy balance on liability and risk, but not having that, think about the problem we're trying to solve, which is reversing nature loss, and focus on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. Annalise, your thoughts?
Great to see we've all been aligned without having a chat. I think the other piece, I think, when we're looking at creation of a nature positive economy, is that we cannot have a myopic view on nature. We saw us having that in climate a little bit historically, and we need to be looking at that system in which we're creating within nature for climate change mitigation and adaptation, for our communities to thrive and for business to succeed. And we can't have any of those without each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, a few of the questions that we've had come through in the Q&A, and we haven't been able to traverse them all today, have touched on some of those points, and just a commitment out there that we will look to pull together a bit of a comms piece answering some of those questions when we release the webinar. So look, what we've heard today, focus on nature-based solutions to climate change and integrating it into broader risk assessments. It's increasing. We're going to have to do that more. Businesses globally, including Littleton Port, are starting to integrate TNFD into their strategies to better understand their nature dependencies and risks, as are Fonterra and Meridian, with support of businesses like PwC. And while it remains voluntary, support for the mandatory nature-related disclosures is increasing, and we can reasonably expect that to be there in the relatively near future. More stakeholders and customers are asking questions about nature and business impacts and broader sustainability reporting. And as Annabelle said, the sooner you can start on building confidence in your nature journey, the more resilient your business will ultimately be. So look, thank you, Annabelle, Annalise, Tina, and also to Crystal for joining us today. We hope everyone has enjoyed this session and got something out of it. As always, the recording of this webinar will be made available on the Aotearoa Circle website. We'll also look to find a good method to answer some of the questions that have come through on the Q&A and provide those insights out as well. So keep an eye on our LinkedIn page, or sign up for our newsletter through our website for future events, or reach out directly to us at the Circle if you have any questions. Kia ora koutou. I hope you all have a fantastic day. Ka kite anō.